we've got to account for that. Now, how did the Air Force deal with the testimony of Jesse Jr.? That's why that alone would be sufficient for me to say that the Air Force committed a fraud, a hoax on the American public when they claimed to have studied the Roswell incident. Here they had a very live customer, Dr. Jesse Marcel Jr.
Did the Air Force even talk to Dr. Marcel?
Yes and no. They did, because he finally, in frustration, on his own time, on his own nickel, went to Washington and confronted them. And the answer he got was, Colonel, they addressed him by his military rank, you're making life difficult for us. That was it. And in this massive report on Roswell, he is mentioned. They have a tiny little encapsulation of a statement that he made that makes it almost sound like, and it's deliberately contrived to make it sound like, what he saw was simply parts of a radar target. That's it. Now, a civilian researcher got upset about this and said, Jesse Jr.'s testimony is critically important. After all these years, yes, time has gone by, but we need to look into this more. Consequently, this researcher went to the FBI and said, you people use memory enhancement experts, do you not? And they said, yeah. And he says, who's the best one you got? And they gave him the name of a psychologist who works in Washington, D.C., turns out has a top-secret clearance because he works for the FBI and the CIA and a bunch of other agencies like that, using various techniques, hypnosis is only one of them, to enhance the memory of somebody. And it might be a license plate, it might be something like that. He thought this would be a very interesting exercise, Jesse Jr. And indeed, they spent 6 hours, 2 hours one day, 2 hours the next, and 2 hours the next day, going back to that incident, to that night. How was your father dressed? How were you dressed? How was your mother dressed? All of these little things back and over and over and over again. The transcript of those sessions is pretty long, but it makes it absolutely fascinating as you go back into this 12-year-old boy's memory and get a lot of details out of it, all of which are consistent, entirely consistent with everything he's ever said on the topic, but it added a few little details. All that we can say for sure is he was not describing a mogul balloon. Remember early, I read you this challenge from the Air Force. They said any dope can look at the testimony and tell it was just from a mogul balloon. Well, I'm sorry, folks. If you deliberately don't look at the testimony, then and only then can you say it was from a mogul balloon. So we have this marvelous piece of information, totally ignored by the Air Force in this massive report, in fact distorted. What they do mention about him totally distorts it. So that's the testimony of Jesse Jr., who's still a very enthusiastic supporter of the idea that Roswell was probably what his father thought it was, not of this earth.
Sir, Jesse Marcel Jr. agrees with his father that what was found on the Brazos Ranch was not of this earth. Would you believe him?
Yes, I would. I believe at his age he was old enough to know what was real and what was not real.
Thank you.
Given the Air Force's challenge, can we assume that Dr. Marcel, then at the age of 11, could distinguish balsa wood from some other exotic material?
Oh, I'm glad you asked me that. And in fact, during these 3 days of hypnotic regression, he was asked questions about that sort of thing over and over again. First of all, he wasn't just 11. He was almost 12. Okay, I have to get that in. Jesse Jr., by his account, and we've been able to back this up, at that time in his life had probably built about 24 model airplanes. Now you say, so what? But this becomes important. In that time frame, you didn't go buy a plastic box and glue together all the little pieces. You bought balsa wood, and you bought big chunks of it, and you bought flat pieces of it, and you bought balsa sticks, and you very carefully whittled and manipulated this wood. You worked with it. Spent a lot of time, and that's how he made all these model airplanes. He was fascinated by airplanes. Consequently, when Jesse Jr. says that the stick he had was not wood, you see, the Air Force says it was just one of these sticks that puts together a radar target, that holds one together. When Jesse Jr. says it was metal, it wasn't wood, we're talking about a true expert, even though he's only a month shy of 12, okay? This is a guy who's been working with balsa wood for years, forming it, polishing it, and so forth. That's an expert. I'm not going to argue with that man on that topic. Sort of goes beyond this, and the testimony of his father is important also. These two were very close, Jesse Sr. and Jesse Jr. And it seems that Jesse Sr. was an all-around technician type of a guy. He was a ham radio operator, and this meant that he built radio transmitters and receivers, usually from scratch. And he taught his son how to do that. And at one point, the skeptics said, yeah, listen, this stuff that you call Bakelite, that's what it was. It was Bakelite. But Jesse Jr. says, no, wait a minute. I've worked with Bakelite a lot in making radio transmitters and receivers with my father. It wasn't Bakelite, and so on. So, both the son and mainly the father had expertise in a lot of different technical fields. For example, the father, partly on a hobby basis, partly on a professional basis, knew a great deal about photography. So you've got electronics, you've got photography, and you've got a general background and mindset in technical things on the part of the father. Some of that was transmitted, obviously, to the son. I trust guys like that when they tell me it wasn't wood, it was metal, and you couldn't bend it and stuff like that. I trust a person like that. So that's where we've gone with Jesse Jr., and that answers that part of the question. Some other people have taken this beyond that point, I'm happy to report. Because if you have a witness who says, well, this was not wood, but you've got the Air Force saying it was wood, it had to be wood, how about the other testimony? We don't get this from the Marcells, but the son of Mac Brazel, remember Mac Brazel, the sheep rancher? His son was an ordinary cowboy. He says that he found some of that stuff, or his father shared some with him, some of the sticks, and he tried to whittle it. And he says, I couldn't whittle that stuff. Now, wait a minute. A cowboy and a farmer, they get a knife when they're about this high, and they've got that knife or a knife the day they die. And they live with these things. They use them for every kind of tool you can imagine, and they wouldn't be without a knife. And when a cowboy says to me, I tried to whittle it with my knife, and it couldn't whittle, again, I've got to believe that guy.